The Victor Black Masterclass presentation is brought to you by
What's up, everybody, and welcome back. Welcome back to the Bridging the Gap podcast. We're here with a very special guest. This is guest, like literally, I don't really have guests on my podcast, so I'm excited to have the man Victor Black on here. And for those of you guys who don't know, potentially been living under a rock. If not, we're trying to get Victor's name out there anyway. We're trying to get the safer use of these types of things that we're going to talk about out there. And Victor's been in this game for 30 plus years, I believe. He's got his own masterclass website, which is something that I've been subscribed to for the last few months and had invaluable information from. And I thought, this is what my listeners need to hear, because I get these stupid questions in my DMs all day, every day. I'm open about my ped use. I'm open about my anabolic use. And there is quite clear that there is a misunderstanding, or there is some practices that people are missing. And I'd like to kind of go through your thought processes, your beliefs, your ideologies, and how you've come around this safer use model, and the best practices that you believe that we can undertake as assisted users. Awesome. So I'll let you run with that, and we can just delve off from there.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the opportunity to come on the show. I'm very mindful of the fact that my awareness in the community is small. I think it's fair to say that over the last year or so, I've been slowly gaining traction, slowly. Every month, more and more people seem to kind of connect to who I am and what I'm talking about. But in the spirit of understanding that a lot of people would go, never heard of this guy, maybe I'll just start off with explaining a little bit about a little more about my background, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So I'm in my mid-50s. I'm still an amateur competitive bodybuilder. I do compete at the high end of the amateur, like the Mr. Olympia. Mr. Olympia. Oh my God, I wish Freudian slipped there. The Mr. Universe type level, sort of thing, in the over 50s class. I've been training since I was a teenager. Literally, I was, one of these guys with, I grew up in the Arnold, Stallone, Van Damme era when, men with muscles were on the screen and front of our minds, sort of thing. I guess I've taken my training more seriously, quote unquote, more seriously since about 19 or 20 years old. But I certainly had, a weight set in the backyard with 13 years old. So a lifetime of practice. I guess in that regard, I see myself as what I would consider to be an evidence-based practitioner. And what I mean by evidence-based practitioner is I'm very much interested in clinical evidence, in sports science, in applied science, in what can we learn from clinical data, but I'm also very interested in practical application and anecdote and observation. And I believe that to get the best outcomes in this domain, you have to marry the two. Yeah. It's all well and good to stand in a white coat somewhere and pontificate about various potential mechanical pathways of hypertrophy and things like that. But I believe unless you spent a significant amount of time under the bar, and potentially if you're if you're interested in competition, whether that's powerlifting or bodybuilding, that you get in there and compete with the guys, as it were. Yeah. So I very much see myself as someone that has a foot in both of those camps. A lot of people identify me as a PED safer use or harm reduction educator, but I spent enough time training as a natural, competing as a natural, to have what I consider to be a good understanding of nutrition and supplementation and training practices as well. So today we're going to talk about what I have been wanting to talk about a little while to the community about, which is really what I call the evolution of enhancement. Yeah. So I guess a timeline understanding of how we got to where we are in 2021 lends itself to people understanding what my message is and what I'm all about. So is it okay if I just kind of jump into that? But any questions you've got, just jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, I already feel like I'm watching a podcast of you talking, so I'm really like engrossed.
For anyone that doesn't watch me, if you let me go, I got a pretty good monologue.
Yeah, I know.
So if at any time we're kind of like I'm stealing the show, make sure you cut me off.
I'll jump in. No worries.
Jump in. No worries. So I guess the first thing I wanted to point out was that the history of application of enhancement practices is nothing new. So testosterone, the hormone testosterone, was synthesized in the mid 1930s time frame. Really in the kind of 50s, 60s timeframe, we saw a ton of different derivatives of testosterone being developed by the pharmaceutical industry. They were not for our tribe. They were
Yeah.
basically being developed for clinical practice. And it really wasn't until the kind of like what you would call the late 60s and 70s type frame that we started to see, you know, more mainstream uptake into the bodybuilding and strength athlete community. I'm sure there were individuals doing it earlier than that. That's fair to say, but
Early
like
adopters.
I reflect back on, you know, I think if you remember the movie Pumping Iron with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, yeah, I don't think anyone has not watched that movie. So if you remember the heavyweight class in the Olympia, there were 3 guys over 200 pounds, right?
Yeah.
So it gives you kind of some sort of framework just on those numbers to go, you know what, it wasn't really mainstream in 1975 because guys weren't busting 200 pounds yet. You know?
Yeah.
I guess what I wanted to talk a little bit about today was since the 1970s today, the evolution of enhancement has been through a number of different phases. And the interesting thing is, I think it's probably fair to say that today we're in the era of evidence-based practitioners and evidence-based educators.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
if we look at what's happening in the natural community, so the unenhanced tribe, there's a long list of very articulate, very intelligent, and fabulous value educators. I'll just name a few guys like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld and Dr. Eric Helms and Dr. Scott Stevenson, you know, and you know, I don't mean to leave anyone off that list, but really, if you look at what they're doing is they're bringing the evidence that we've learned from, you know, applied science studies over the last 25 years and helping us to better understand how we can optimize our outcomes through training and supplementation and nutrition. Yeah. It's my opinion that body of work, that effort has been well worth the effort. If you look at how far natural bodybuilders have come in the last 20 years, particularly in areas like conditioning, it's phenomenal.
Yeah,
right?
Completely agreed.
Yeah, one could even argue that the level of conditioning of elite naturals is probably better than the enhanced community at the moment.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
They've come a very, very long way. And I think that comes down to our understanding of physiology and our understanding of nutrition and just a better merging of anecdote and observation with science. Okay. Now, on the other side, it's fair to say that there is a fairly large community that, you know, don't feel comfortable with that. You know, the bros, if you would like to call it that. And it's also fair to say that they still probably have the numbers. Yeah.
Yes,
if you think of that term. And those individuals, if you follow very carefully that community, they get a lot of stick. They get hit pretty hard at times by bros, basically with derogatory comments about like, you just need to eat more and lift heavy shit, basically. And although I don't disagree, I would say that, you know, like there's a fair story where you could kind of stand somewhere in the middle and listen to both camps. You're in. One of the criticisms that I would have of the evidence-based community day is a lot of people out there that look no better than, you know, your average gym rat sort of thing, and yet they have PhDs in, you know, how to create hypertrophic outcomes. And you're kind of thinking all that knowledge, and you still look the same. Like you have to question at times. And I tend to take the stance of saying, look, I like to listen to both camps. I like to listen to the old school guys, and I like to listen to the evidence. And I like to draw my own opinions and my own conclusions based on what both of those camps have to say. Okay, so if we were to take that as a kind of like a state of the nation of where we are in natural training, it only makes sense on a purely logical and rational basis that, you know, since the 1970s, that enhanced training practices has probably been through a couple of generations of, you know, or iterations of use development. Okay, so if I can just take a minute to describe what they are, in my opinion, then we can get into the nuts and bolts of so where is the current state of play. So what did the 1970s look like? If you understood the 1970s, a lot of people look back on that with rose-colored glasses, and they'll say really positive things like, you know, they knew what they were doing and they didn't take very much drugs. But the truth is that, you know, it was very much a period of like, we didn't really know what worked. In fact, I would argue you were up against a deliberate, intentional propaganda machine of denial, where if you look at some of the studies that were done in that time frame, they were, I mean, you have to look at them, and I'm not saying I have any evidence to support this, but you have to ask the question why. There was, for example, studies going on where they were giving women 1,200 milligrams a week of Primobolan, where they were giving women 1,050 milligrams a week of Mastron to understand their tolerance towards these drugs for, efficacy and safety trials in estrogen-mediated breast cancer. And in the same breath, there were trials going on with men to determine whether or not these drugs had performance-enhancing effects, where they were giving them 140 milligrams a week. And you just have to sit there and go, that doesn't fucking make any sense. Like, what's going on there? And if you speak to anyone with credibility, I literally had a podcast yesterday with a doctor who was around at the time in the Olympic scene, and he freely admits it was propaganda. They were deliberately and intentionally trying to play down the fact that these things worked. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say the 1970s timeframe was very much, experimenting with things to see, quote unquote, what worked and what didn't work. Yeah. And this is where I start to get myself into hot water with people, because I will say things that I think if you listen carefully to what I say, it's true. There's guys like Tom Platz. So Tom Platz, in my opinion, is one of the most intelligent, most articulate, most passionate guys that this industry has ever had the pleasure of, being a member of our tribe. Yeah. But some of the things he was doing in his personal drug use, you wouldn't do today. And we wouldn't do them because we just know better. I'll give you a simple example. One of the practices they used to do was they would taper down dosages at the end of a cycle, hoping that as they used less and less androgens, that the HPTA would restart itself. And of course, we know today, until compounds reach non-suppressive levels, nothing happens. So you basically get to the wall, you stop, you remove the suppressive compound, and you allow the HPTA to start. The whole premise of tapering down over a month achieves absolutely nothing. So this was a common practice in the 70s, and the reason I pointed out was, I'm not critical of it, it's what was done, because we just didn't understand what we were doing. If that makes sense.
For sure.
And then the 1980s timeframe was a time frame where we started looking at more what I would call ancillaries, like insulin and growth hormone kind of first appeared on the scene during that time frame. And of course, the synergy of these compounds meant we took a surge forward in terms of physique development, from just using anabolic steroids to be able to access these new tools. That was an interesting time. And I think it's fair to say that we probably reached the zenith of understanding, quote unquote, what works in the 90s. In fact, one could probably fairly easily argue that the 90s was the peak era of physique development in competitive bodybuilding, with the guys of that time frame were as muscular and as conditioned as anyone today. So I don't think that we've actually figured out too much more about, quote unquote, what works since the 90s.
That makes a lot of sense.
But I think it's also fair to say that even in the 90s, when you listen to guys talk about the 90s, I don't know whether you've had the privilege of listening to Ronnie Coleman talk about his personal drug use, but I mean, he's probably the greatest bodybuilder that ever lived, but he didn't get there because of his understanding of enhancement practice. Let's just say that.
I've heard a few quotes from him as well.
Genetics and hard work got Ronnie where he is. And obviously drug use is on the table, but it wasn't his sophistication of the use of these tools. Let's just say it that way. It was agricultural at best.
For sure.
So I think that the evolution is interesting. 70s was experimental. 80s was the introduction of ancillaries. 90, we probably reached the zenith of, this works. Now, I would argue that it's since the 2000 era, like in the last 20 years, that we've started to get the evidence that we need to move past what works and start moving into what I would call safer use models. Okay. And that's kind of really where I kind of kick in with my information. There are, quite bluntly, a lot of guys that are still doing what was done in the 90s, maybe, a little bit trapped in the 90s, saying, well, that was the zenith and they knew what they were doing, and unquestionably they did. But if you understand some of the practices, there were a lot of things going on there that I would question. People say they didn't use as much drugs. I have long argued that's not true, because, I think people have used moderate dosages. I think people have used abusive dosages right out the gate from day one. 100%. I think some of the things that they were doing in the 90s, though, I don't support. I think that the overuse of diuretics in competition was rife. There were a lot of people that were addicted to drugs like Nubain, which was a pain medication, sort of basically, So there was a lot of things that were going on that I would describe as highly effective, but not necessarily in our best interest, if that makes sense. Now,
yeah.
I say that, and you have to understand there's a wall of people coming at me going, how fucking dare you? You're like, this is just
the issue with it. That's the issue with it, is breaking down that wall.
This is where I live. I live in this thing where the guys from the 70s don't like what I'm saying. The guys from the 90s don't like what I'm saying. But the truth is if you translate this conversation into natural training and you talk about supplementation, you have to understand, I grew up in the period where, you would walk into a supplement store and everything you picked up was a lie.
Yeah.
This is bullshit. Like, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. I probably paid for a house with things that don't work. It was just how it was back then.
Yeah.
Now, thanks to educational providers today, we are so much better equipped about, where we should spend our money on supplementation. I think we're just a world away from where we were in the 90s. And this is what I'm trying to explain to people. My conversations are not about works. We already know that works. I'm trying to get people to understand and ask the questions like, well, is there plausibly a safer model? Now, why would that matter? Probably for a few reasons. The first being that I think it's fair to say that more people than ever are exposing themselves to these drugs.
Yep.
There was a time when only really serious trainers took steroids and enhancement practices. Today, it's become, we even use the term performance and image enhancing drugs to reflect the fact that, it's not even enhancement, it's image enhancement.
Entirely, for a lot of people, for sure.
And also, I think it's fair to say that the age or the duration of exposure has grown massively, massively. 1975, and I don't say this to be conceited, it's just a statement of fact. If I was competing in 1975, I would have been fourth in the Olympia. Why? Because there were 3 competitors, right? The point being is that, the number of people that are using these drugs have increased exponentially. And there are guys in their 50s doing these things like I am, right? Now, historically, people would expose themselves for 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years, and they would retire, and that was basically it. Today, I think it's fair to say that you have recreational users using drugs for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and I think it's just a rational, logical thing to say, look, if that's you, if you're a recreational user, if you're not making bank, if you're not a world-class elite athlete, and what you're doing, you love to do, and you want to do it for the next 35 years, maybe the models that we used in the 90s, which were all about maximum outcome, are not the right models to follow. If I could show you a model that said, look, I can give you 80% of the return, and half the risk, would you be interested in hearing it? Now, immediately that separates the audience, because there are some people out there that would say, no, I won't accept 80%. I want the 100%. And that's not my audience.
For sure. Yeah, I understand that.
My audience are the guys that are saying, I understand you can't do what these guys did for 25 years. The bill will come due.
Yeah.
So I'm all ears, Victor. Tell me about these models. Tell me how they work. And this is kind of brings us to where we are today, and the conversations that we're having with the community about, drug selection, compound selection, dosage selection, how we, cycle on, how we cycle off, what we avoid, what we embrace. This is, I guess, the evolution of enhancement, what's led us to this threshold point today. Now, I don't want to compare myself to these guys like Brad Schoenfeld and Eric Helms. I'm certainly not in that caliber of academic. I speak, in my opinion, with the voice of experience, the guy that's been, at this grind for 35 years and seen guys come and seen guys go and learned lots of lessons along the way. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's a great kind of intro as to kind of where we are right now. And I think the penny drops when you kind of make it very clear that, like, we have spent the last 25, 30 years maximizing, improving, making it as efficient as possible in terms of natural bodybuilding. What's the best supplements? We got years and years of data on things now, and why wouldn't you do that for, something that's going to perform as an
it doesn't make any sense why that same paradigm doesn't directly transfer into enhanced training. Why would it not? Is the question is, you're going to have to convince me why would it not, as opposed to why would it? Yeah.
I think also the people who are potentially stuck in the bro mindset with drugs are probably on the side of evidence-based nutrition and training. They're probably going forward with that, but not with
the irony is, I would argue very few of the bros today haven't picked up something from that camp.
Yeah.
Okay. Very few of them are so shut off that they haven't taken on something. Now, to the magnitude of immersion varies from a little bit to like I'm all in. And I would say that it's fair to say that that's true in the enhanced tribe as well. There are some guys that are all in, and there are some guys that are standing on the edge saying, I'm kind of interested in what you have to say a little bit, and they got half an ear cocked, and there are guys throwing sticks and stones and telling me to fuck off, basically, which I completely understand. How dare I step in there and tell you, what Tom Platz was doing, is maybe there's a better way of doing things because he's Tom Platz. I'm not critical of Tom. I think Tom's just a fabulous resource and a legend to the sport. But we knew what we knew in 1970 and 1980, and the evidence that we have to make decisions with today is just it's different information to make decisions from.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. So maybe let's just talk about a little bit how, let's say, your cycle protocol would differ from the 80s or 90s. I mean, in my head, I immediately go, right, what does someone take to start with? 500 milligrams testosterone. Yep. And people's argument is, if you're going to switch off your HPTA axis, then why wouldn't you do 500 rather than just 200? And maybe why does yours differ from what the bros would say?
So I would even say that the 1970s was probably the era pre-testosterone. It was, very much dominated by, anabolics like D-bol and, other oral steroids were very popular. Guys, very common, cycles were nandrolone only cycles, or nandrolone and D-bol, or nandrolone and primobolan. I mean, unless you knew the man personally, I don't think you have the right to say who did what. But I think it's fair to say that, lots of people repeat the discussion that, Arnold was a famous, primobolan and D-bol guy. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not. I've never met the man. I've never spoken to him, but I think it's repeated often enough to probably say there's probably some smoke there. That's probably true. So the 1970s, I wouldn't even say were testosterone based. It was, testosterone based derivatives. And I think it's fair to say that in the 90s, as aromatase inhibitors and tamoxifen and different SERMs came onto the market, the popularity of using testosterone kind of grew into that space. But if I was to say in an overall sense, a lot of people confuse my cycle design as basically just saying, look, less. And I'm not arguing there's not less on the table, but that's not what I'm about. What I'm saying is, listen, let's begin the discussion with cycle design on needs-based. Yep. I would like to understand who you are as a genetically unique individual, how old you are in training age, and what goals that you have realized to date. What are your next series of goals? What are your long-term goals? Are you going to be retiring in 2 years and not using these drugs anymore? Yeah. Is this a lifelong, journey for you? Are you aspiring professional trying to make bank? Are you a pure hobbyist? Who you are and what your goals are is where the conversation begins.
Exactly. We're literally 45 seconds into a criteria before you even pick a drug, right? Whereas we're in this life where it's like, it's a blanket cycle, and you just like,
I shit you not. The other day I was talking on probably the biggest bodybuilding forum in the world, and someone made a comment about one of the guys I'm training, looked at a photograph and started recommending a cycle. And I'm just kind of like, dude, you've never met the man, nothing about him, but you know what drugs he needs. And it's ludicrous like this. But I'm empathetic because this is our history. Like this is the way things are done. People have forever mimicked what Tom did, or what I heard such and such did this, so therefore I'm gonna mimic that. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I used to buy the magazines, and I used to read what like Ronnie used to. I would literally set for set copy Dorian Yates's training programs out of the magazines. I'm not Dorian Yates. I don't aspire to be Dorian Yates. I certainly don't have his talent. So why would I be mimicking what his behaviors are in terms of training volume or intensity loading patterns or anything else like that. It makes no sense from a training point of view. It makes no sense from enhancement. So you begin the conversation with, let's understand who Josh is, right? Let's understand where he's come from. Let's understand his personal exposure to these tools to date. Let's understand where he's going. And then based on that, we can start to put a model together based on what I simply refer to as need. Okay.
Yep.
Now, the needs of a bodybuilder and the needs of a powerlifter are obviously different, but I would argue the needs of a 25-year-old aspiring professional are also different to someone that says, look, I don't have the genetics to cut it in that. I'm just like my training and I want to do this when I'm 70. You know, they're different needs. You would plan the strategic future for those individuals completely differently. Yep. Yeah. What I would argue is most people historically have done nothing more than this and said, look, there are about 8 different metabolic pathways that in theory we could modulate in 2021 through different tools, but I'm just going to pick up, the sledgehammer that's called anabolic steroids, and I'm going to pound as hard as I fucking can on the androgen receptor until something breaks. That's most people's cycle design. They would equate the use of growth hormone as that's for advanced trainers, and even advanced trainers sometimes besmirch that. They'll say, oh, you're just a beginner, you don't need these tools. And I would argue that the best logical, rational, and safest model that you could probably pick would be saying, first, let's identify your needs, and then potentially let's identify what pathways that we have the capability of modulating through artificial means. Yeah. And then let's start to modulate those very, very moderately. Let's elevate androgens to some degree. Let's elevate IGF-1, growth hormone to some degree. Let's look at fuel supply efficiency discussions through insulin and various other metabolic pathways. But there's no logical, rational reason that says you need to do what most people do, which is you start off at 600 milligrams a test. Over the next 2 years, you take more and more and more steroids until you get to the point where you feel guilty because you're taking 3 grams a week. And so you start then taking growth hormone, and you take as much growth hormone as you can afford. The consideration for most people is growth hormone is what can I afford? And then when you cap out at, in 6 or 8 units or whatever you can afford, then you begin the application of insulin. Like the entire model of walking into design is just like it's completely there's no rational logic to it beyond it works. No one's saying it doesn't work. What I'm suggesting is that in 2021 we could probably sit down and come up with a more strategic and more surgical strategy to meet people's needs. Now, before I go on, let me just point out the downside to this, because anybody that gets on their soapbox and talks about something, one of my pet peeves is not being completely transparent and saying, well, what's the downside to that model? And I think it's important you understand that. So the downside to a model of that means that you need to be better educated. You need to know more. Okay. Taking, 100 milligrams of D-bol a day is not exact. There's not a lot to know. Okay. It's pretty simple, right? But if you start modulating 6, 7 different pathways at once, this logically means you need to know more. You need to be better informed. And that means that the amount of time that you spend learning about this is going to probably be a lot more than, your average bro wants to put in. The second thing is that would by definition mean more moving parts. So there's more to juggle, and it would, without question, no question, it would mean more money. Okay. If someone says to me like, okay, so I have no budget for anything like that. You have to understand testosterone and nandrolone are dirt cheap. They cost virtually nothing. The cost of testosterone at supraphysiological levels, the cost of nandrolone at supraphysiological levels is pennies.
Nothing.
In
$50
fact,
a month less.
There's a Dante Trudel was famous for writing a cycle methodology called Cycles for Pennies, and it was literally how do you get the largest amount of bang for your buck during, and it's fair to say it's a very agricultural cycle. I don't support the cycle. I don't recommend the cycle, but it was where we were at in 2003 or whenever he wrote that, 2001, can't remember. The point being is, to follow this model, you're going to have to learn more. You're going to have to juggle more parts, and it's going to cost you more money. No question about that whatsoever. Now, some people are going to say, well, I don't know whether I want to do that. I just want to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I have no problem with that. I tend to I have an audience that follows me that says, look, I'm a pretty serious recreational trainer,
Yeah.
or, I'm on the border of, recreational, amateur, competitor, professional, a lot of my clients are coaches because they are willing to learn. They're willing to put the time in. They say, look, don't worry about the hours that I need to put in learning. I'm here to learn. So, that would be the downside to this model. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing for me that played in my head when I because obviously I'm a competitor, I'm trying to be the best in the world. That's my goal at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate I'm gonna have to push things at once. And when I started kind of adopting this whatever multifaceted approach, whatever you want to call it, the question that rang in my head was, I appreciate that I'm doing it safer, but am I missing out on something? Am I missing out on some extra gains? Am I missing out on
I'll answer that question. It's really easy to answer. If you're doing just anabolic steroids and you're simply modulating the androgen receptor, okay. So let me be technically correct, because I like to be historically correct. Someone's going to watch this in 10 years and say, but blah blah blah. So I'm not sure whether yourself, you're probably aware of this, but anabolic steroids or androgens have a number of different mechanisms of action. One is directly via the androgen receptor itself, which is what we call classic genomic pathways. Yeah. And then we have the non-classic genomic pathways, which are basically not directly via the cell-located androgen receptor, but it's via other pathways like membrane-located androgen receptors and via other direct pathways. So if you just consider the most simplest discussion, say anabolic steroids are ligands to the androgen receptor, they bind with the androgen receptor and they cause downstream gene transcription, right? If you just look at that is one of 8 plausible different metabolic pathways that we have the power to modulate. Now, if you were to take the model that said, no, well, I'm going to kind of pull back a little bit on that. I'm not going to smash on that too hard because I'm spending money and time modulating the other 7 as well. And if you said, well, am I missing out on that? It's really simple. If you take those 8 pathways and you turn the volume up to 100%, you're probably going to kick the shit out of the guy who's just doing steroids. You understand what I'm saying? The question is then, okay, so if you modulate all the pathways that you can modulate at the absolute maximum return, that is the absolute maximum return. This is what I have denialists basically say, yeah, but you'll never get to such and such. I say, you'll never get to such and such on the doses that I use. But there's no reason that if you have a greater risk profile on me that you cannot follow in these footsteps, but just turn the volume up a little harder across each of these different pathways. And if you do that, I will give you a guarantee that you're going to, exceed the outcomes of someone who's only modulating one of those pathways to abusive levels.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. Do you want to talk about the pathways? Do you want to talk about them, or are they a little bit complicated?
No, I'm more than happy to talk about. I think most people would be familiar with the first one, which is the androgen receptor. And then, of course, we consider the non-classical genomic pathway as a secondary pathway. This is interesting because there are certain testosterone derivatives that tend to bias themselves more towards cell-located androgen receptor membrane, for example. Now, that might not be a good idea, and it's probably outside the scope of today's discussion, but it is fair to say that drugs that tend to, drugs like Debol, for example, that they are shown to have a preference or a bias towards, membrane-located androgen receptors, and there's some potential toxicities associated with that pathway. Okay. But it's enough in this instance to know, okay, so the first is the classic genomic pathway. The second is the non-classic. If we just say those two. You can't really control, where you send the androgens beyond compound selection. Okay. Compound selection determines which of those pathways the androgens take. But all androgens activate both classic and non-classic. It's to what magnitude do they bias towards one. And then I would say one of the massively misunderstood and undervalued pathways is via the estrogen receptor itself. It's very well understood that people that overly suppress estrogen are missing out on returns. Okay, this is very, very, very clear and it's held in good quality evidence.
For sure.
So people that overly suppress estrogen are inhibiting hypertrophic response because of their actions. So how you manage estrogen and the way that you go about estrogen modulation is potentially something that can add to your progress or inhibit your progress. And my recommendation generally is that you start off with the drug testosterone and you take as much testosterone as you as a genetically unique individual can tolerate without needing a DHT blocker, without needing an AI or a SERM. And when you reach that threshold, you bring in a secondary drug, ideally one that does not continue to add more estrogen or more DHT, which the obvious choice is a DHT-based derivative, and you continue to add to your anabolic potential load without adding more estrogen to the table. So by doing that model, you're fulfilling the classic genomic pathway, the non-classic genomic pathway, and the estrogen receptor pathway itself. Don't massively attenuate or inhibit estrogen. It is a hypertrophic pathway in its own right.
For sure. Yep. And then potentially just for the listeners, when you say use testosterone, try and find your genetic tolerance, find out where your unique tolerance is. I guess they're looking out for estrogenic related side effects. So maybe high blood pressure.
Yeah, the great challenge though is, and this is where I get myself in trouble, a lot of the symptoms that people associate with estrogen are not estrogen related at all. Okay. So I'll give you an example. So most people would basically associate water retention as an estrogenic side effect. You know? But if you understand what causes water retention, it's the elevation of the effector molecule, the RAS system called angiotensin II. When you elevate angiotensin II, you elevate the hormone aldosterone. And anyone that knows what aldosterone does, it means you retain water. This is the pathway through which you retain water through the use of growth hormone. So when we use growth hormone and we retain water, that's not estrogen that's causing that, that's aldosterone. And when we use anabolic steroids, what happens is aldosterone is elevated. The elevation of aldosterone is basically, so by using an angiotensin II receptor blocker like telmisartan or one of the other 7 ARBs, most people that introduce an ARB go, holy shit, like I thought that was estrogen. That's actually, that's angiotensin II that's causing that. So now, don't get me wrong, if you keep pushing estrogen up and up and up and up, right, there's no question that estrogen has a water retention, stimulatory input. No question at all. But not at the amount. Like, so for example, I want to say take as much testosterone as you can tolerate. My tolerance levels for testosterone without an AI, without any other drugs on the table, is I tend to tolerate about 300 milligrams a week, a little more than that. Right now,
about the same.
The amount of testosterone that is metabolized into estradiol, right, at that dose, right, is not water retentive in the absence of angiotensin II. It's not enough estrogen for you to be walking around like a puffball.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So yes, I do agree. For guys that are using 2 grams of testosterone, this is a factor, but that's an awful lot of testosterone.
For sure.
Yeah. So at moderate dose of testosterone, most of the water retentive effect that you see in moderate use of testosterone is consequential to the elevation of angiotensin II, which in turn elevates aldosterone. The same mechanical pathway that's responsible for water retention through growth hormone use. Now, when you put testosterone, estrogen, and growth hormone together on the same table, you tend to have a kind of like a situation where you go, I'm holding some water, but you can modulate or you can manage that effect by blocking of the angiotensin II pathway. Okay, so just for anyone watching, we got cut off then, so there's a little bit of it in that sort of thing. Let me throw up a graphic. I actually have a graphic that I like to use to show people the rationale behind my cycle design methodology. So let me just throw this up and cover up my talking head for a bit. So if we look at this from the point of view of like these this hub, so we have a baseline testosterone hub. So this is what I was saying, as much testosterone as you can tolerate as a genetically unique individual. For me, that's about 300 milligrams a week. I think that 300 milligrams a week is a very tolerable amount of testosterone, particularly in the context of understanding that today there are millions of men using 200 milligrams a week under the model of TRT, HRT, as it were.
So would you say, would you just say that people should start at 300 in order to find their tolerance, or start at 200? And
no, typically what I would, it depends on how much experience you've got. If this was like your first year of exposure, I would always recommend that you start at what would be considered to be the clinical effective dose and titrate for effect. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. I've been doing this so long and you've been doing this so long, you just go straight to 300.
Yeah. Of course.
I'm not going to be fluffing around going from 150 to 200, 250, but I do that with clients who this is their inexperienced clients, novices, we'll call them that. Yep.
That makes sense.
So if we have testosterone now, this is going to be, again, lots of people like get their knickers in a twist and they understand this. If you understand that there is an abundance of evidence in rat models that talks about the myotrophic androgenic ratio of various testosterone derivatives, and this particular drug is more anabolic than that particular drug. This has been used as a compound selection discussion for 25 years. I heard that trenbolone is 5 times more anabolic than testosterone, whatever like that. Of course, we know that that's complete and utter rubbish. But anyway, there are rodent models that basically would allocate myotrophic to androgenic ratios that exceed testosterones in rat models. And I don't have a problem with that. The reality, though, is anyone that spent any time in the trenches will appreciate the fact that if you take 300 milligrams of testosterone and you take 300 milligrams of Anavar a week, despite the fact that the rat models say, right, you don't grow any faster, right? Okay. So almost all anabolic steroid derivatives accrete protein at approximately the same rate, approximately. I don't have any problem with saying, look, we could in theory measure some differential, but they're approximately the same. No one has ever, done a nandrolone diet cycle because it is supposedly more anabolic and smashed everybody on the stage because nandrolone is more anabolic than testosterone. What rubbish. They all accrete protein at a level that approximates equal efficiency. Okay, so therefore, the drug that you choose to put on the table next, there's lots of scope for personal preference. Some guys like Primobolan, some guys like Masteron, some guys like nandrolone, some guys like Anavar. I would suggest that you try them all because there's a very good likelihood that as a genetically unique individual, one of those drugs might speak to you. Yeah. But this idea that, this drug or that drug is more anabolic, it's just rubbish. So in other words, we have a protein accretion need via, the gene transcription pathway of the androgen receptor. Then there's the what we call the androgen receptor, the estrogen receptor beta gene transcription that we spoke about. Then there's the capacity for various drugs to have anti-catabolic action. Trenbolone is the standout in this regard. A lot of people do not understand why trenbolone is such an effective growth promotion tool, and that is because it has a unique relationship with the glucocorticoid receptor. It is, effectively, if I use an analogy, if you were to basically say, look, there's 2 ways to save money, put money in the bank. One is to make more money, protein accretion. The other is to save more money, minimize muscle protein breakdown, right? But the magic happens is when you do both at the same time. Now, the reason trenbolone works so well, it is unique amongst most of the anabolic steroids in so much as that it's really basically contributing to muscle tissue acquisition through minimizing muscle protein breakdown. Okay. So when you come at the conversation from both ends, something that's increasing muscle protein synthesis, something that's increasing muscle protein or minimizing muscle protein breakdown, you have a 1 + 1 = 3 synergy. It's the first synergy there is. So most anabolic steroids, all of them have something to add to anti-catabolic action, but trenbolone is kind of special in that regard. So this is a pathway. I mean, obviously we have, the IGF-1 insulin pathways. These are pathways we spoke about before. There's obviously then consideration beyond protein accretion when we start to talk about, so what else do these anabolic steroids do? And I would argue that's really the reason that you would choose one compound over another. And that is, so outside of just protein accretion, what does it do that separates itself from other drugs? And the easiest one to answer there is for people that are familiar with the concept of mechanical response. In other words, you get a certain stimulation of the central nervous system versus certain drugs. And this is why powerlifters like to use drugs like halotestin and, Superdrol and things like that. They stimulate the central nervous system. In general, DHT derivatives tend to do very well at this. In general. Now, we haven't gotten to the safer use model yet. We're just talking about the premise of, putting it. So again, if you were to look at something like MENT, right, you'd say, okay, so someone will ask me, what do you think about MENT, Victor? I would say, well, tell me what need you have to fulfill and why you feel that ment would fulfill that need. And as long as you can describe to me what that need is, I don't have a problem with it, but most people can't. They're coming from the point of view of, I heard it's the strongest anabolic there is. That's their interest, you know. And this is where, for years and years and years, people basically held Trenbolone up as the most powerful anabolic is, not understanding that is in reality a steroidal SARM. And to get the most out of Trenbolone, you only need a very small amount because you just need to cover the back door. Trenbolone covers the back door really nicely at small amounts, and you minimize most of the negative consequences of use. Yes, of course, if you add more and more of it, it's an androgen. It binds with the androgen receptor. It causes gene transcriptions. I'm not saying it doesn't work. What I'm saying, though, is the thing that's unique about Trenbolone is it covers the back door. It minimizes muscle protein breakdown. But to do that, you only need a relatively small amount of the drug, which means we can balance what we get from it against the negative consequence of use of that drug. Okay. So then we get into things like fuel supply efficiency discussions, which is really
talking around
insulin.
150 milligrams.
So I would argue, as a general rule of thumb, you should take the clinical dose of these drugs and 2x it. So what I mean by that is, if you accept the fact that testosterone is given to millions of men at 200 milligrams a week now, I don't think 400 milligrams a week for our tribe is outrageous. Okay. If you look at Anavar, 20 milligrams a week is the clinical dose. I think 40 milligrams a day is, 20 milligrams a day is the clinical dose. I don't think 40 is outrageous. I don't think you need to take 80 milligrams. Yeah. So as you go down the list and you go, okay, so how much Masteron did they give women for estrogen-mediated breast cancer? They gave them 300 milligrams a week. So we could probably use 600. How much did they use Supremabolin? 400 milligrams a week. So 800 is not outrageous. So it's the 2x rule. Now, what most people don't understand about Trenbolone is when it was in human clinical use, it was given to women and the elderly for treatment indications like osteoporosis. And it was given to people at 50 milligrams a week, okay? 76 milligrams, 3 vials in a box, 1 vial administered every 10 days, so 50 milligrams a week. So the 2x rule is, surprise, surprise, 100 milligrams a week. And people say, but it won't do anything at 100 milligrams a week. You have to understand, you have to wind backwards and listen to what I said. The clinical dose was 50 milligrams a week. It does something at 50, right? So let's 2x it, yeah? When you hear people say 300 milligrams a week of Trenbolone is a little bit, you have to understand that's 6x. So imagine if someone said to you, look, I'm taking 1,200 milligrams a week of testosterone. That's just a little bit. You go, you idiot. That's not a little bit. You're in? 6x of the clinical dose is not a little bit. 2x is moderate use. Okay. So if we consider that a pathway, and then we look at fuel supply efficiency discussions, which was really about the various insulin analogs, so Lantus and Humalog and the basal and rapid acting insulin sensitizers. Obviously, what would be considered to be relatively benign substances like creatine monohydrate, but they certainly have a role. I like telmisartan because telmisartan is both an ARB, an angiotensin receptor blocker, but it's also a PPAR agonist of all 3 isoforms of PPAR, okay? So it is, in effect, in covering one of the pathways. Now, the one pathway left that after you go through all this list that we would, everybody's chasing is myostatin inhibition, okay? So this is the great chase. Now, the irony is that there are many different compounds from creatine to HMB to all sorts of different things that have been identified as potential myostatin inhibitors over the years. The challenge with them has always been, but to what clinical effect? Can we demonstrate it's true in human beings? The irony is there are some studies in women that show when you give them an ARB that they have an improvement in body composition, and the pathway through which that happens is through myostatin inhibition. Now, I'm not saying that if you gave a natural man an ARB, that his improvement in lean body mass would be large enough to measure in a study, but we can see it in women. And the reason we see it in women, they tend to be exquisitely sensitive to these inputs. So it's fair to say, not in rats, in human beings, the drug telmisartan and other ARBs like losartan have demonstrated clinical effect as myostatin inhibitors. But I completely agree to what magnitude of effect, probably fairly small. But the whole premise here is this. if you're just mitigating or modulating one pathway, you need the magnitude of impact of that pathway to be truly profound.
Mm-hmm.
If you're touching on all of them, anything that you put on the table, even the drug clenbuterol, which is a beta-2 androgenic agonist receptor, right? This, in women, we know is a hypertrophic agent because they're so exquisitely sensitive to growth promotion inputs. Now, in a man, you might say, listen, if you give clenbuterol to a man, you're not going to see a hypertrophic response. And I really don't have a problem with that discussion. But I keep trying to understand, but there's other pathways. We're doing other things. It only has to contribute a little bit, for it to make sense that says, look, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, right, equals 16. So this is the methodology, this is the model. Now, where does safer use come into this? I would say two things. The dose is the poison. So how much of these tools you put onto each pathway is going to determine the safety profile of each of these discussions. It's completely plausible that someone takes this model and abuses it. You turn the volume up to 11 on all these pathways. It's no safer than making anything else anyone's doing. The safety margin is not built into the model. It's built into the dose. We effectively are using smaller amounts of these compounds because we're we're modulating multiple pathways for effect. But if you abuse the model, you lose the safety margin. Okay. So the final thing that I would put out there on this, and that would be saying this, and that is, okay, so the safety thing would come like this. First, you take all of the drugs that you could potentially use, right, and you put them into two nice little piles. The first pile is drugs that have been approved for and in human clinical use for at least 10 years, okay? I don't like research chemicals that have been abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry because they were proven to be carcinogens and things like this. I'm not a fan, okay? I'm not a fan of animal drugs. Why do we need to use drugs that have never been in human clinical use? To what end? Quote unquote, but it works, bro. I'm not arguing it doesn't work. If you introduce an androgen that has been used in veterinary studies or in veterinary application, it's very likely that the androgen is going to bind to the androgen receptor and cause gene transcription. I'm concerned about the other impacts of toxicity. Okay, so if you said, right, first rule of thumb, no animal drugs, no abandoned research chemicals, minimum use of methylated orals, and the dose is the poison, you very quickly arrive at a point where you start going, yeah, I can see this kind of makes sense. This is a model that is based on need. It's based on rational logic. It's based on what clinical evidence do we have to suggest the efficacy and the safety of these products, not it's a rat model. We want to see these drugs ideally in human beings and understand the implications of toxicity in human beings. And so, anyone that sits down and look at this model and understands the following caveat, I am not trying to have a conversation that says this works better. As I go back to the original point we made in the 90s, I think in the 90s, we figured out, how you get the biggest outcome you can possibly get. We figured that out a long time ago. I'm trying to explain to people, look, some of those practices may have been less than ideal, effective, but perhaps not in our best interest in terms of safety profile. And hopefully people watching this can go, yeah, look, I get that, obviously now the devil becomes the detail, because there's a lot of people out there that could look at that and still take this model and put it together and bastardize it and make a hash of it, sort of thing. So this is a first pass discussion. Obviously it's intended to be, okay, now let's break the things down and have a conversation about growth hormone, the good, the bad, the ugly. What is the problem with growth hormone? What is the problem with insulin? How can we use insulin safety? How do we not go into hypoglycemic state? How do we not induce insulin resistance? How do we not become a type 2 diabetic, after years of abuse, et cetera, et cetera? So it's the first pass of what becomes a somewhat more complicated conversation for those people that can connect with the story.
Yeah. No, it makes complete sense. And as someone who connected with that story, it completely uphold and changed my entire philosophy about drug usage, right? I think I was pretty lucky that I'd only been using drugs. I had a really good coach, so I started off pretty low, and I'd hardly been using drugs. But if I hadn't, and I hadn't found you, I would have definitely delved off into the different direction. And
correct.
Thank God that's here.
So I'd like to make one last statement, and we probably should close it off, because I found that people after about an hour tend to glaze over and go, "Oh, that was enough," right? Let me just make one last statement. And it's really important. I'm trying to get this message out to people. A lot of people do not understand this, and that is that these various testosterone derivatives actually create oxidative stress at various magnitudes, right? So we would consider testosterone at moderate doses to be cognitive protective of cognitive function, okay? Cardioprotective, principally through the estrogen that is created as a metabolite of testosterone. Estrogen provides cardiovascular health support, yeah? And kidney protective, again, estrogen is basically renally protective against elevated androgens. So testosterone would be considered to be the most benign of the anabolic steroids we have at moderate dosages. No question about it. Once you cross that physiological barrier, oxidative stress presents. Right. But it's important that people understand, when you look at the other testosterone derivatives, each one of those derivatives, even though it may seem to be very similar on a chemical structure basis, is demonstrated very clearly in evidence that there are various levels of oxidative stress associated on different organs from these drugs at different levels. A simple example, the drug Winstrol is probably considered to be relatively benign on cognitive function. It's demonstrated to have fairly moderate negative effect on the brain, okay? However, I'm not really a fan of Winstrol because of what it does to HDL carrier suppression. So I would consider that drug to have two opposing vectors. If it was purely a discussion about cognitive protection, I would say it probably gets a pretty good tick. It's not healthy for you, but of all the choices, it's probably one of the better ones. But unfortunately, what it does to your cholesterol levels, if you subscribe to the model that lipid skewing is not something that we want to encourage, it's the worst of all the drugs in terms of lipid skewing. It's devastating. So this becomes an interesting paradigm then, because you have a drug that is both potentially the best drug that we can have after testosterone for our brain, and potentially the worst drug that we can have for our heart, depending on what it does to lipid skewing, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, every individual is going to respond in a genetically unique way to each drug, but it's important that people understand that these drugs are not all created equal. Various drugs have various concerns and various biases towards certain toxicities. There are 7 different androgen toxicities that we need to be mindful of, and various drugs, when you stack them up, will say, okay, so that particular drug seems to bias itself, not so good on that toxicity, but maybe better on that one. And some of them basically maybe not good news across the board. Now, that is a message that's very hard to get across to people. It's as hard to get across as this idea that there is not a massive myotrophic androgenic ratio difference in human beings. People struggle with it because they haven't been told that for years and years and years and years. The message has basically been that anabolic steroids are bad for you. Right? And so people accept the risk. But I would argue that testosterone, if you take a hypergonadal man, a man that has low testosterone, and you restore his testosterone levels to upper normal range, that is positive to every qualitative and quantitative aspect of his life. That's not bad for you. That's good for you. But if you keep going and keep going and keep going, eventually you cross a toxicity threshold that says, now we're presenting problems. Okay? All of the other anabolic steroids have to be viewed through the filter of saying potential toxicity on one or more of the 7 toxicity pathways right out the box, right from the get-go. Every single one. 10 milligrams of Winstrol can devastate your HDL levels. 10 milligrams of Winstrol appears to be relatively well tolerated on the human brain. So cool. So that's a lot of talking, and I talk very fast. I hope I haven't overwhelmed people in the audience, but I guess the point is that you can kind of put it on half speed if I talk too quickly. So
Yeah, no, that's perfect, and like it's a good introduction to Victor Black and the model, and I really encourage people to just get onto Victor's Instagram, get onto the masterclass as well. Like there's mountains of knowledge, and it keeps coming in mountains as well. So that's
the great irony, Josh, is a lot of people think, God, like he talks a lot, but what people don't understand is I'm not joking when I say I've been at this for 5 years now, like putting information into the marketplace about safer use, and I'm not joking when I say I've got a lot more to say than I've already said.
Yeah,
During like the amount of information that's coming is insane. Now, I completely understand that for the average recreational lifter, it's too much. They're going like, dude, like I got this. So my bias, I would basically say, look, if you're a coach, you need to kind of come and listen over here because there's educational. If you're a recreational trainer, you need to lean on your coach, right? So your coach needs to be, listening to what I have to say, literally on a weekly basis. And if you're a recreational trainer, you're probably going to go like, that's too much time, that's too much effort. I'm electrician, or I'm a plumber, or I'm an accountant or a lawyer, whatever you happen to be doing as a profession. But I do think for coaches, I do think for people that make a living from this space, and I do think for people that work with enhanced athletes, okay, that you need to come over and have a listen to what we're saying in this community.
Yeah, completely agreed. I appreciate your time this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you. Yeah, just go 5 o'clock here in Thailand, sir.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, and thanks for listening, everyone. And we'll be back very soon.
The Victor Black Masterclass presentation is brought to you by